Welcome, everybody. If you are just now joining us, you have arrived at the Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays, presented by University of Maryland Extension and our Woodland Stewardship Education Program. My name is Luke McCauley. I am your host today. I'm a wildlife management specialist for the state, where I work on topics related to wildlife in agricultural areas, wildlife in forested areas, wildlife in grasslands. I have a focus right now on early succession habitat and damage in agricultural crops, which is a big problem for a lot of farmers. And I'm excited to host today a great colleague of mine, Shannon Browne. But let's get together through some housekeeping items. As usual, our webinar is being recorded. You probably got a note about that. And we will put this up on our website shortly after the webinar. If you registered in advance, you'll be added to a newsletter, a quarterly newsletter of upcoming events, and then you can opt out by sending an email to pthomas@umd.edu with the message "No events." If you have any questions during the presentation, there's a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. It looks like this picture here on the right, and you can pop in your questions right there, and we will address those at the end. And we'll also have a brief survey at the end to ask what you liked about it and things we could do to help make this a better webinar in the future. And I want to introduce the topic of the day. The title of the talk that Shannon is going to be giving is Ecology of Maryland's Cave Bats. Not all bats are cave bats, but a lot of them are. Some of them live in trees as well and don't use caves. Maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that from Shannon. Dr. Shannon Browne is a senior lecturer over at the University of Maryland in the Environmental Science and Technology Department. She teaches a variety of classes, including GIS, mapping software class, special topics where she's engaged in research related to bats, currently looking at surveying areas that might be impacted by new toll lanes and new traffic highways that are being proposed. And she mentioned to me that she may have found a new species of bat that is new to Maryland. So she's working on confirming that, which is really exciting. She teaches wildlife ecology and management courses. I had the pleasure and honor of teaching vegetation monitoring and quantifying vegetation at one of her classes last spring, which was a great time and really fun, great students. Here's her email at the bottom, shannonpb@umd.edu, if you need to reach her for any questions. Next month, we'll be having an update on forest health from the Department of Agriculture for pests and diseases that are coming up and how they're doing in Maryland forests. That's on November 16th. So we like to run a little poll, see where everybody's coming from today, get to know the audience a little bit. And I will go ahead and launch this. Where do you live on this map? Feel free to pop in. These are the regions and dividing lines for the state. Great to see a lot of people from both Eastern and Western Maryland. Pretty good, broad diversity of people. Only one from Southern Maryland. I'm a big Southern Maryland fan, so welcome. And a couple people from outside of Maryland. So thanks for coming. And with that, I will close and just say thanks for joining us. If you need to reach me for anything or have questions or suggestions for speakers or topics that you're interested in, please send me an email, lukemac@umd.edu. Experts in the field that you would like to hear from, topics that you're curious about. Definitely want to make this something that the public can gain from. So with that, I will stop my share and let Shannon take it away. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Browne.
I just changed the title slightly. I apologize for that. It's still the same intention. I may have just changed around the wording to decrease the size of the title. But as Luke mentioned, I am going to be just really focusing on the ecology about the cave bats. So the bats that in the wintertime are hibernating in caves rather than migrating further south where their food is available year-round. So just the ones that are migrating in caves in the winter. And you may have seen this map already. You may have heard of white nose syndrome already. But for those of you who haven't, those bat species, so in Maryland we have 6 bat species that are cave species, or they hibernate in conditions that are similar to caves. So what I mean by that is the temperature is very cold, so just right around freezing or slightly above freezing, so the temperature stays constant, and the humidity level is high, and the humidity level stays constant. There's also a lot of moisture on the ground as well. So when they wake up from torpor, every week or so, when they wake up out of torpor, they have some water that they can drink to rehydrate themselves. And then they go back into torpor. But the issue with white nose syndrome is, so this is a whole disease process. It starts with skin fungus. So the fungus, so pseudogymnoascens, the structans, but I'll just call it the fungus, gets in the skin membrane. And for many of these species, when they're hibernating or when they're in torpor, their immune response is not as fast as normal. So this fungus can invade the skin membrane and make it look like there's this white fuzz appearance. And so it's not that it has this fungus on its face, so it's on its muzzle and skin or wing membranes. It's not the fungus itself that kills the bats. We've lost between 90 and 99% of our cave bat species in Maryland. Not from the fungus, but from the whole reaction from it. So it's very irritating. I don't know if any of you have ever had a skin fungus before, but it's itchy. And so you spend a lot of time scratching to try to make that itch go away. And also the bats are grooming that area as well. And as they're doing that, they're staying awake longer periods of winter when they are normally in torpor. And when they're awake and grooming themselves and scratching themselves, they're using up a lot of energy, a lot of the resources that they really needed to maintain them throughout the winter. So they end up becoming dehydrated and then malnourished because our bats are insectivorous and the insects that they eat aren't available in winter. So they become malnourished, their electrolytes become off balance, and eventually they die from this whole disease process itself. So it started first in a cave in New York, and each year, and a few would survive, most of them would die, but those survivors would develop immunity and then move across the landscape during the year, and then swarm around fall, which we'll talk about a little bit, and they go back into hibernation. But during that time, those survivors had spores on them. And so they were able to deposit those spores, unintentionally, of course, but they, these little microscopic spores would be all around the caves. So the cave ceilings and cave walls where they had moved around. And so now the new bats coming in would be exposed to those spores, because the spores are able to, they're still able to invade bats for many, many, many years. Okay, so even though there's not a host for a full year almost, they still can infect a new bat that doesn't have immunity. So those bats come into the cave, they decrease their respiratory rate, their heart rate, their blood pressure, their immune response. They slow down, so they're just above freezing, and their heart rate, had been in the hundreds. Now it's down to very few beats per minute. And so then this cycle continues of we lose 90 to 99% of those bats. So we've seen this massive spread over half of the states and country. And so we're losing our cave bat species. We've lost a ton of them, as I mentioned, 90 to 99%. So here's just a graph showing you, this huge decline. So in this kind of orangish color, so Myotis leucipicus, so that's the little brown bat. So little brown bats, so that species used to be the most numerous across North America. And because of their ecology, they tend to, or I should say their natural history, one of their survival methods is they congregate in large groups in the winter during hibernation and in the summer during their summer maternity roosts. They would congregate in the thousands. And so those numbers, you really see those numbers coming down very, very quickly and very significantly. So as I mentioned, little brown bats used to be the most populous, or I'm sorry, the most numerous in North America. Now they're one of the fewest in North America. And so they're currently under consideration by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to be listed as threatened and endangered. In blue, we have tricolor bats. So Peromyotus lucificus. So their numbers went down somewhat, not quite as much right away, but then we have very few of those. Septentrionalis, so northern long-ear, we didn't see quite as much of a rapid decline just because there were already so few hibernating in our caves and our cave conditions in Maryland. Big brown bats are somewhat similar to little brown bats, where they are gregarious. They may not group in the thousands, but they might group in the hundreds or the dozens. So we weren't too surprised. We didn't see that much of a drop in that year when we first had white nose invade Maryland. And in fact, in Maryland and in some other states, we think their population might actually be increasing. But that's not to say they're not sensitive to white nose. They still are, but their population levels are much more secure than our other cave bat species. So in our state, so I mentioned a few of these so far, but in our state, so we have 6 bat species that are hibernating. And when we look across the species map, so the more red the color, the more red side of the rainbow, if you will, that indicates more diversity in that area. So in Maryland, we're not red. We don't have that much diversity as compared to out west, but we have around 6 cave hibernating bat species in the western portion of the state, and almost through the Piedmont area. And then as we go more towards the shore, we lose some of the diversity. So we're seeing we have big brown bat and tricolor bat in little brown bat in all parts of our state. Northern long-ear bat, their habitat is a little bit more specific. So they're looking for very dense forests and forests with tree species that have bark that's sloughing. They like sloughing bark. Indiana bats like sloughing bark. Eastern small-footed bat, we're going to see more on the west, out west, and up and through the Piedmont. In the summertime, they're really preferring cliffs and rock crevices. So we're going to talk about things like their habitat in a little bit. But basically, the takeaway of this slide was the majority of our species are living in the western portions of Maryland. And then we start coming down in species as we get Piedmont and as we get more east. Okay, so I wanted to go through a little bit of detail about the different seasons, just so you can keep that in mind if you're trying to encourage more bats on your land or if you're trying to discourage bats on your land. I think it's very helpful to understand their natural history and think about it through time. So I'm going to start in the summer. So in the summer, our bats are in their summer roost location. So some of these species, as I mentioned earlier, are gregarious and they form these maternity colonies. So these areas where many mothers work together. So it could be in a certain tree. So there could be a tree roost, or it could be an attic or something like that. But an area that can hold the temperature at a uniform temperature and the humidity is staying somewhat uniform. But there's area for the moms, and when they have their pups can all stay together and be close to each other to increase their body temperature. Okay, so some species have these big maternity colonies. Some species will just be on their own. The females will be on their own instead of forming a large maternity colony. So each species has some kind of unique characteristic when we look through their natural history. Okay. So tricolor bat, eastern small-footed, they're more of roosting by themselves. And then on the opposite side, the little brown bat, big brown bat, Indiana bat are, so they're more gregarious and they're roosting in large quantities. And you'll notice I'm not talking about the moms and their pups. So the moms are completely involved with pregnancy, with lactation or nursing, with teaching the pups how to fly, um, having them learn how to hunt on their own. So moms are involved. The dads are off living their own lives. So the dads are not involved with pup rearing whatsoever. So when we see bats, one question is, is what species is it? But is it male or female? And if it's female, could she be pregnant or not? So pregnancy is usually like May and June, and then the pups are born. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a little bit. But we need to be, aware of if she's potentially pregnant or she's going to have high energy needs for the pregnancy or for nursing. And then after the pups are born, we need to think about that timing also, because if we're trying to remove a bat from an area, if it's a certain time, so if it's August, let's say, if we remove a bat and if we don't know if it's male or female, we don't know, did she leave behind a pup? Or if we remove all the females, did they leave behind all the pups? So we need to think about the timing. The bachelors are changing locations every few days. So some species, like eastern small-footed bat, they're changing their roost every like 1.1 day on average, whereas some other species are changing their roost every 6 or 7 days. So the bachelors are changing roosts constantly, where the mothers are they show pretty strong site fidelity, so returning to the same place that was successful the year before. They tend to return to the same place, unless there's some event that is disruptive enough that they needed to move their pup somewhere else. Otherwise, those moms are pretty loyal to where they go each summer. And in summer, most of our cave bats are having one pup. Our big brown bats are larger than our other cave bats, and we've actually seen twins many times with big brown bats. But when they're born, on day one, I wish I had a picture of that. Their eyes haven't opened yet. They're furless. They're cold. They need extra warmth somehow. They're very vulnerable at this stage. But here's just like 2.5 weeks later, this pup is looking very, very almost independent. So resembling the parents very much, and starting to learn how to fly. And so when mom is picking out that roost, if she's an experienced mother, she'll know that it takes a while for pups to learn how to fly and learn how to forage. So many times as they're learning, many times they'll fall and drop onto the ground. So she's going to pick a roost site where she can get the pup after it's fallen, and she'll be able to climb it back up and into the roost. So she's looking for a substrate that she can climb back up. So brick, her claws can climb up brick, up most tree species, unless it's a very slick tree species, a certain rock, but not things like siding and poles. So things that are slick are going to be very challenging for her to be able to climb back up with her pup. So think about, she's delivering a pup like 20 to 25% of her weight, and within a month, it's almost exactly her size. So it would be extremely difficult for her to carry something that big back up. So she's looking for locations that are easier to climb up. The diet. So each of our bat species has unique diet preferences. So this just happens to be an example of big brown bats. So big brown bat diet, they're big beetle specialists, but they'll eat other orders of insects as well. And then our smaller size cave bats are tending to eat smaller size and softer bodied insects. But each species definitely has shown preferences for certain insects. So fall time. So fall is the opportunity to engorge on food, get as many calories and fat as possible to store over winter. So we see a lot of swarming. So the bats are going to be hunting for food extra. This is also their time for mating, is in the fall. So so the female will mate with multiple males, and the males will mate with multiple females. So this is mostly happening in the fall time. And if it's successful, her body will go into the cave or the cave-like condition. She'll go into torpor, and her body will just store the sperm. So storing sperm for several months doesn't take up much energy. It's not until the spring later when it will implant, fully fertilize, and become an embryo. So early spring is when the pregnancy really begins. So wintertime is really just storing the sperm. So wintertime is about using as little energy as needed. So there's going to be lots of rounds of torpor, of decreasing temperature, decreasing heart rate, and all of that, all those processes. And then in a few days later or a few weeks later, coming out of torpor to drink, rehydrate, urinate, so the kidneys don't become toxic. And then, so they've moved around the cave wall a little bit, and they go back into torpor. And they wake up again and move back into torpor. And we've counted the number of days these species average in torpor by using different thermal cameras, and calculate. There's been lots of research in calculating how long these species are in torpor. So it's not a full hibernation. They're not asleep, if you will. They're not in that torpor condition all of winter. It's just periods of time. So spring, when the insects are becoming available again, in spring, the bats will come out of hibernation and start making their way to their summer roost. So their summer roost of whatever it is they prefer. So each species has their own preference for their summer roosts. So some will like very open areas. Some will like very highly dense forested areas. Some will like dense forested areas with some openings and near fresh water and slow moving water. Some will like the interior of the forests. Some will like the edge or the exterior of the forests where it's butting up against an open area. So each of the species has unique preferences of the different parts of their habitat. So I try not to overgeneralize things. I try to, when I'm answering someone's question, I try to find out exactly which species they're interested in. I'm going to stop talking about the seasons. I'm going to take a little break to look through the chat. Go up to the top. Thank you for handling some of those questions.
We did have a question come in asking about the source of white nose syndrome. I don't know if you wanted to try answer that right here.
Yeah, so in Europe, I don't remember which country. In I want to say it was Eastern Europe. It's been so many years since I read that paper, but there definitely was a paper where they went to several different countries, taking swabs on the cave wall, the cave ceiling, the bats themselves. Now they have completely different bat species than what we have, but they have very similar conditions. So someone was taking these swab samples to look at the fungus species to see which fungus species most closely resembled Pseudogymnoascus destructans. And the one that it looks like it came from, I want to say it was Eastern Europe, but I would have to check that paper again. But the takeaway message from that paper was, in this country, there is this fungus species, then there are these bat species, and they coexist. Why do they coexist? Why didn't they have this event? And we, look through many past records, and whether it's printed record or if it's talking to other people through other records. But have there been any records of these massive die-offs in caves? Because it literally is devastating to, each year you go into a cave and you see thousands of bats in pretty much the same part of the cave every single time. And this time when you go into a cave, to see thousands on the floor, like either right at the entrance to the cave or just right where their normal roosting spot was, but to just literally see thousands of them dead. So it was a pretty huge, significant event that got a lot of attention. I mean, it took us a while to figure out what exactly was causing it. But when we look back, so once we figured out what was causing it, someone was thinking, hey, well, let's try to figure out the source of it. So they were swabbing all over Europe and maybe parts of Asia, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, so they found that fungus. So why did those species have no problem with it? You know, what is it about those species or their immune response? Why did they not have a problem when they were first introduced to that fungus? So we don't know that quite yet. So that's kind of ongoing. That story is ongoing as to why those species did fine, but our species here did not do fine. So they co-evolved, but almost like which came first, chicken or the egg. So I don't want to say it was France. I want to say it was more east than that. But yeah, so right now the most logical explanation is these tiny little microscopic spores were on someone's gear. So if it was the coveralls they were wearing, the helmet, the light, the gloves, the boots, whatever it was, it somehow got on their gear, and then they came over to New York and went exploring around the cave in New York. And it's very difficult to get rid of this this fungus. It you know, high temperatures for long periods of time, or chemicals. And that's not stuff we usually do with our gear. You know, as we're caving, we don't typically expose, we don't typically disinfect with those kind of methods because we want our expensive gear to last a long time. So, you know, we were very naive back then about going between different habitats, especially different countries. But that takeaway message still is important for other taxa as well, because we're seeing in our amphibians, we're seeing another fungus showing similar properties. So by study, it's still very important to study this, and that was an excellent question. So discovering this is helping many taxa, not just bats. So it's helping us as biologists are out in the field surveying. Now we're more cognizant of where we're going and where we've been, and are we potentially transporting something we didn't mean to. So we take a lot more time to think about decontamination protocols, not only between sites we visit, but also between animals that we're handling. So it's really changed the survey method for the better. Let me see if there's another question. So changing roosts, yeah, so moving from one tree to another tree. So those males, those bachelors, are constantly moving across the landscape using different trees. So it can make it challenging for us to know if certain species are present or not, because they are constantly changing. So that's why we don't survey an area just once. You know, we go many days in a row, we go back many times. So yeah, so the males are changing quite often. The females, they'll stay in their area if it's a good area. I shouldn't say they necessarily stay. Some species show very high site fidelity. Some species not quite as much. But so it really depends on which species we're talking about. So kind of on average, the females are returning to the same maternity roost location if it had been successful previously. But you know, if something happens in the middle of the day that is very disruptive, she might change roosts sooner than the average. Do all the bats wake up at the same time, or do they all go in a torpor together? So no, sometimes they'll bump into each other, and sometimes that will arouse the other bat to wake up, but it's not all at the same time. So when we look at those thermal imaging videos, it's really, you see one moving around and then another moving around. And it's crazy to watch these colors lighting up and moving and stuff. It's pretty fun to see it, but no, it's not all at the same time. Okay. I think I got the chat questions addressed so far. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the natural history of our cave bats, and we talked a lot about fungus, but that's not to say they're not also impacted by wind energy, by habitat loss. So there's other reasons for the population decline as well, but for cave bat species, white nose is the most significant factor impacting their species right now. But other factors are as well. Now, wind energy has a high impact on our migratory bats. So that's a whole other lecture about migratory bats. So you may have heard, you may have been reading a lot about like red bats and hoary bats and silverhair bats hitting a lot of these wind turbines. But our cave bats do as well. Okay. So there's several different recommendations I can make to try to help the ones who are surviving and to help their future pups survive. So, you know, I don't want it to be an all doom and gloom presentation. I want it to be a good, happy takeaway. So there's lots of things we can do to help them. So we can consider installing bat boxes. So especially if we are in the process of evicting a bat out of our home, they came into our home because they're looking for habitat, safe shelter during the day. So we could provide them safe shelter, just not in the house. So after we've evicted them and sealed up the area they came into, we want to encourage them to use these bat boxes. So if we can install these bat boxes early, they'll be familiar with them because every night when they're flying around, they're looking across the landscape. So they're looking not just for in the summer, they're not just looking for water to rehydrate and looking for insects to eat. They're also looking for potential roost sites. So when I talk about roost sites, I really mean those daytime roosts. That's not to say they don't also take breaks at night as they're foraging and getting water. They also have nighttime roosts. So they have these temporary kind of stopovers, if you will. So they're constantly looking for places to take breaks at night. And so they're learning more about their environment. And so if they see a great big bat house, they might remember that next time. So it could be they use it for a few hours, or it could be if something happens during the day at their regular day roost, it could be that they end up moving into that bat house. Or that bat house might get used a few times by our bachelor bats. So it's hard to tell if a bat box is successfully occupied or not, just because of the way we install it, what they're looking for. So we want to put a bat box. We want to create habitat for an animal that is going to mimic their natural area. So they're really looking for roosts. They're looking pretty high up. So we're talking 15, 20 feet. They're looking for large spaces overall, so they have temperature and humidity level gradients. But they're looking for tight quarters. So when they come in to sleep, their bodies flatten, and they're actually very small when their body flattens. So like during one of my surveys at Fort Delaware, so an abandoned fortress, that space, that mortar between bricks. So there's like space that had been chiseled out, and bats can flatten their bodies and get in there. So they can get in that little space. So it's amazing how flat their bodies can get. So they like these narrow areas, but with huge places to move around. So because temperature is slightly changing, humidity is slightly changing, and they want to have these options for warming up. They also, during the day it gets really, really hot, so they're very dehydrated. The first thing they want to do is go drink water. So when they emerge from their house or wherever their roost is, they're really looking for places that are within a quarter mile, maybe a half mile from water. And it can't be just any water. They really prefer the quiet water versus like rapids. They really prefer quiet water, quiet, still. So ponds, lakes, rivers, as long as the river isn't too many rapids or not large rapids. So they're really, when they're looking for their habitats or looking for a place to roost, they're really looking to stay within around a quarter mile and up high and against a substrate that mom can climb back up with her pup, and dark inside, pretty warm. So to get these warm, they typically need more than 6 hours of direct sunlight, like maybe 8 hours or more of direct sunlight. If they're aiming kind of in the south direction, so between southeast and south, around that, the boxes tend to get very warm and stay very warm. I've seen them still be occupied even on trees and in forests. I have seen them occupied, maybe not quite as much as if they're out in the open, but again, it depends on the species. So big brown bats prefer more open areas. So we tend to get a lot of big brown bats in these bat houses when we attach them to our houses or near our houses. Whereas, our smaller size bats are much more agile, and they tend to prefer closer to the interior of forests. So we see some species changes depending on where we're placing our bat boxes. The other thing they're going to need is 5 to 10 feet of clearance for when they drop out and then change direction and start flying. So it takes less energy. If you drop and gain speed by dropping, you're just using gravity. You're not using any of your energy. And then when you flip over and start flying, then you start using energy. They need 5 or 10 feet of clearance, air clearance, 3 dimensions. So it can't be like directly above an awning, let's say, or directly above some huge branch, because the mom's not really going to like it very much. So there's a lot of things to think about with bat boxes. And I could go on, but I don't want to do that because I want to talk about other things as well. So fresh water. So in very arid environments, so like out west, cattle troughs are a great way to attract not only bats, but other native species as well. So adding fresh water. Keeping our water clean. So doing what we can to try to prevent adding, extra chemicals or pesticides, extra fertilizers, extra ice, as we're applying ice on our sidewalks or roads. So because eventually if it doesn't stay right, nothing stays right there. It always ends up getting into our water sources. So if we can use alternatives, safer alternatives to keep our water quality better, that's going to benefit everyone, not just the bats. Also, if we can use less pervious pavement, because pervious pavement, so like the asphalt and concrete mixes that we use for buildings and sidewalks, there's a purpose for that. But if we can try to decrease the usage of that and use more impervious options. So pervious pavements instead of impervious pavements. Sorry, I may have misspoken there. So we want the water to trickle through the soil, and we want it to be fresh water trickling. We don't want added chemicals of any kind. So here's just one example near me in Virginia. So this one government location they've changed out their entire parking lot from impervious surface to pervious surface. And no one would know. It looks the same, it feels the same. We've been driving on it for years. It's lasting. And no one would know unless you walked to the very back and saw this sign saying no plowing and no chemicals. Otherwise, you wouldn't have known that it was pervious pavement instead of impervious pavement. Trying to promote habitat for the food that they're eating, so for the insects. So try to have those rain gardens and wildflower gardens, things like that are going to promote more insects and more insect diversity. So deep six, the spraying against bees, deep six it. Let's appreciate our bees. Let's appreciate all the insects that we have. So in my study, this hasn't gone out to publication yet, so I'm not going to give any details, but I will say the trees in suburban areas were significantly important to some of our cave bats. So, so they were preferring the taller trees in suburban areas, but maintaining tall trees, right next to our homes can be very tricky. So I recommend in that case, instead of calling to have a tree removed, is there some amendments? So could an arborist come and provide cabling or bracing to have that tree last longer? Because it's providing a lot of benefits. It could be that it's providing a lot of insects. It could be that it's providing roosts either all of the summer or parts of the summer. It's making changes to the soil. So lots and lots of benefits from trees. So let's try to keep our trees, especially in suburban areas. And then in other areas where we have dead or dying trees, hey, other bat species really love those. So some of our bat species, our Indiana bats and our little brown bats, really, really like those dying and dead trees, so the snags. Whereas our tricolor bats really like those live trees and the deciduous tree species. So we have a lot of different preferences, or a big spectrum of preferences of tree roosts between our different bat species. Education whenever possible. So whatever we can do to tell people, hey, let's try to think about the bats. They don't have a voice of their own, so we have to be the voice for them. So all these different ideas, and I'm sure you have many more ideas. All these ideas cost time and money, right? But maybe not everyone knows that USDA, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, so they have staff that are available to help landowners as they want to implement changes that are helping wildlife habitat. So it could be in the form of advice, so coming to someone's property and giving some advice about how they could improve the property for wildlife, or it could be some of them give out bat boxes if someone applies. So there's financial incentives. They can help out in so many ways. And then if you know of bat roosts in Maryland, there is this form, and I'll share the slides with Luke, who can distribute to whomever. But for the state of Maryland, there is this form you can fill out saying where that roost is and how many came out of it. And Maryland DNR just asks that you count during certain times of the year. Because remember, in the early part of the summer, moms are pregnant. Then the middle part of the summer, they're giving birth and nursing. And then within a month, the young are already full grown, basically, and they're independent. And so we're hoping to see those numbers increase. So from before the pups are volant or flying, before volancy, and then after volancy, we're hoping those numbers continue increasing. If you are at all involved in the HOT, the I-495, I-270 managed lanes study, so for the proposed HOT toll lanes that go from I-495 in Virginia across Maryland up to 270 and up that 270 corridor. So that project is going to remove a lot of habitat, and especially I found high tricolor activity in that area. And as I mentioned, tricolors and little brown bats are being listed right now by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It hasn't taken effect yet, but it's in the process. And then our other federally endangered species, so Indiana bats, and then northern long-eared bats. Northern long-eared bats had been listed as threatened, and they're still also in the process of being downlisted from threatened to endangered because their numbers have plummeted so much across the landscape. Now, these bats I mentioned are already state listed. So these are state endangered bats. But this project is federally funded. So it had to go through a federal process. So that in the federal process, they're looking to see if the animals are federally threatened or endangered. So if anyone is living in that Montgomery County area and is interested, we can talk, we can chat afterwards. but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so this is the last federal agency to review the final environmental impact statement for the managed lane study. They extended their deadline to accept testimony from anyone interested. They've extended their deadline until October 28th. So we can talk about that specifically afterwards, but I'm happy to stop sharing and then be able to see you instead of a computer screen and listen to questions and also read questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. That was great. I shared in the chat a link to that reporting form that you had in your slide, as well as the DNR guide page on bat boxes, which has a lot of design options and placement and goes into a lot of detail. So
bigger is better. So they want lots of chambers. So like a 3-chamber bat house or bigger. The tiny ones, save your money.
Cool. I know I have a question for placement. I want a bat box at my house, but just while people formulate your questions, please do enter them in the chat or start unmuting yourself, raise your hand. But I'll fill in as people think about their questions, I'll fill in with a question of my own. I'm hesitant to put it on my house because there's going to be holes in the siding and maybe that'll be an entry point for moisture, insects, whatever. If there's a lone tree, do you advise, do you advise against putting on a tree if it's sort of on its own in a sunny area?
If it's sunny, if it meets all the criteria. So if you are within like let's say a quarter mile of clean drinking water, if it's an area that isn't too noisy, like especially during the day, let's see what else. If there's clearance, airspace clearance underneath it, so not branches right below it. If you can be in sun for a long time. I don't have any problem with the tree, but I'm not an arborist. I don't know the best way to apply it to the tree because these things get heavy. So especially the larger size ones start to get pretty heavy. And I'm not quite sure like what size drill would need to be used. And so like what kind of bolting system would be used to apply it to the tree so it stays. So I just worry about the tree itself also. But I've seen it done and I've seen them very successful. But I think it was planned out just for the short term, not for the long term. So does your tree still have another 50 years on it, another 75 years on it? Or, a lot of it depends. So I don't know quite yet. But so if there is a safe way, so if we could hear from an arborist that sure, you could take up this percentage of the DBH without harming it, and you could go this far deep without harming it. Once I know those numbers, I would say go for it. But until then, I'm a little hesitant until I know more, until I talk to an arborist to see what those are.
Very, very good points. Very good points. Don't want to have a dead tree or kill a tree in the process, especially if it's close to your house. Okay, we have some questions already in the chat. One was, we have a colony of about 100 bats in our bat house. That's awesome. They leave in winter and come back each year. I assume this is the same colony. Is that correct?
Most likely, if they were big brown bats to begin with, and if you're seeing the same numbers coming back each year, because from that, like the second or third slide where I showed you the dramatic decrease of our species, those little brown bats used to be the ones in the hundreds or thousands in bat boxes. And there used to be, we would see almost no other species there. Well, now that we've lost almost all the little browns, now the big browns are starting to come in. And some other species are coming in. But now we're starting to see, maybe not in the thousands in our bat boxes, but we're starting to see several big browns coming into the bat boxes. So if you asked me this question 15 years ago, I would have said you probably have 100 little brown bats, and yeah, it's the same exact moms coming back year after year after year. But now that we have white nose, now I would say it's most likely big brown bats, since you said 100, because they are gregarious, and they're pretty hardy. They have a lot more fat content of all of our cave species, they have the highest fat content. They have the highest ability to fight off the white nose process. So they've succeeded the best out of all of our cave bats. So I would say right now, I would put $100 bet on it's big brown bats, and it's the same big brown moms coming back. So my question, I guess, to you is, how many years are we talking that they've been coming back? Are we talking just in the last few years, or are we talking the last 20 years?
It was John V that asked. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to clarify, give us any more additional information. How often they've been coming back?
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure it's the big brown bats, and we've been here. I would say it's been about 6 years that we've had them.
Okay. Big browns, most likely the same moms coming back. Yeah, that's awesome. You must have a really big size bat house, or you must have several attached to each other.
We do have several, but they really prefer the original house, which is, I think, 3 or 4 layers. We also have what they call bat condo, which is supposed to be able to house like what,
100 or
I don't know, several hundreds, and they don't prefer that one. And we also have a bat nursery that's differently configured, and they don't seem to like that at all, really. So
sometimes it's the simplest design, like shutters.
yeah,
Love
exactly.
shutters.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so great question.
Terry Tabler asked, I was surprised to see the bats forage stink bugs, a pariah to my tomatoes. They have very few predators in North America for good reason. They emit a powerful toxin, and it's like a topical anesthesia. How do bats tolerate this?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, our smaller bats probably wouldn't even be foraging on those, since that has a pretty hard exoskeleton. It would probably be the big browns. And my picture was actually more of an example of the insects in that order, in the same order. So in that order, when I try to think down to species level, I'm not sure which of the stink bag species it was eating, because the papers didn't go into that level of detail. But I believe in our area we have a native species and we have an exotic invasive species. So I'm not sure if maybe they're fine tolerating the native species. I'm not quite sure about that. How they tolerate that. I don't know that, but I do know, we've got species out west that they're foraging on scorpions. Doesn't affect them. So they do have amazing immune responses. I mean, just case in point, when we think to COVID, in China, there's over 200 species of COVID over there, and their bats don't get it. Their bats don't get COVID. So they can handle 200 different species, completely different species of COVID, and their immune system has no problem with it. So they're just amazing, amazing creatures. And their immune system can handle flying, recovering, the muscle recovery from flying. Flying is a huge, huge feat. It's just incredible to be able to fly, and they recover from that every single day. They're teeny tiny. They weigh like a quarter, and they're able to fly on their own. It's just remarkable, and their bodies can recover from it. So that's like, for us, like if we were to run a marathon every single day of our lives, like from once we were able to walk until our last day, we were running a marathon every day without taking a break. Like, no, our bodies need time to recover. Our muscles, everything needs time to recover. But their immune systems are just super rapid and can recover from so many things. So sorry, that's my long way of saying I have no idea.
Oh, thanks. Katie Swear asks, I've read conflicting things about bat boxes. Are there some cons and some negative things, and how can we prevent them? Yeah,
there's definitely cons. So now you have bats interacting with each other that may not have previously. So, whenever we bring additional individuals together, so again, relating back to COVID, we're taking a risk as we are getting in close contact where we're breathing in that same space and we're rubbing up right against other individuals for hours and hours a day for many days in a row, that's always going to have a risk to it. So now you're going to be exposed to whatever the other individual, if the other individual has something, now you're exposed to it. So, so there are some cons as well. Also, depending on the placement, you could be introducing predators. I think someone mentioned earlier in the chat about there aren't too many predators. It's just, it's different. So we don't see the predation events because we're just not out there at night when they're active. It's very dark at night. We are not adapted to see at night and to be able to interpret the environment and what's around us when it's really dark. But that's when these other animals, or nocturnal animals, are evolved to see very well and to hunt very well in the dark. So they're just either using other senses or they have other adaptations that allow them to see well in the dark. So we're not seeing these predation events. Okay, so we're not seeing snakes climbing up into the bat boxes. We're not seeing someone's cat climbing up a tree and picking them out. We're not seeing raccoons climbing in, getting their hands in. We're not seeing maybe a few species of hawk or owls coming in and taking them. The pups that fall and mom isn't able to get them up, we're not seeing those pups, what animals coming for the pups. So we're missing a lot of the predation events that are happening. And we try to prevent things. So like at cave entrances, we might put gates up at cave entrances so that people can't get in, but there's still air, that airflow, that constant airflow to allow that constant cold and humid temperature. We can put up these gates, but still the animals around there are figuring it out pretty quickly, and they'll just wait patiently for all the bats to start coming out, and they'll just pick them right off. So we're trying to create this new habitat for them because we removed their habitat from a variety of reasons. We've removed their habitat. So we're trying to replace that habitat that they need to stay safe. But that habitat needs a lot of airspace for them to be able to drop and fly away. So we can't put a big baffle at the entrance and exit of the bat house because that baffle would stop them from flying. And so our bat box isn't going to get used. So we need it open, but we don't want the predators coming in and taking them off. So that's another reason why I'm saying bigger is better. So if you can have, a pretty big bat house where the raccoon's arm isn't quite long enough, the cat's arm isn't quite long enough to get to the ones that have backed up to the top. So that's one of the reasons bigger is better. So we try to do what we can. And yes, there are some cons involved, but the pros so far seem to outweigh the cons. But then there's going to be the answer of, well, we don't know what we don't know. So, 10 years from now, this answer might change. 5 years from now, this answer might change.
Thank you, Shannon. And the last question we have left, and also Terry noted that there's a dead link on the identification page to Vermont's Fish and Wildlife Department. I found it, and I'm going to put it out to everybody. The last question we had was, how about mosquitoes? What's your take on how many mosquitoes are they taking out and eating?
Yeah, our smaller size bats are usually going for the mosquitoes, and it's a fraction of their diet. So yeah, they might eat hundreds of mosquitoes a day. So like a little brown might eat hundreds of mosquitoes a day. They're going to eat a lot of other insects as well, but it's not enough to really, like, one bat isn't going to make an impact on the insect population. Now, hundreds or thousands of bats, sure. So like, if anyone here has been to either Bracken Cave or Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, and you see, a million free-tail bats coming out from under the bridge, or if you see 20 million coming out of the cave, they have big impacts on insects. When you get into the millions, you're gonna have big big impact on a lot of different pest species. But they're, you know, the bigger bat population size we can get, you know, the bigger insect control we're going to get. So yeah, so they're not having as much impact on certain insect species as we'd like, but still, I mean, insects are providing food to not only bats, also birds. So, you know, insects have a purpose also. Sorry, mosquitoes specifically have a purpose also. Now, I'm not a fan. There's one of the many insect species we have I'm highly allergic to. And like I'll cover myself head to toe with sprays, DEET. I'll put that stuff on my gear and stuff, and I'll miss like a corner of my eye. I won't have put spray on, and that Asian tiger mosquito will find it, and then half my body is swollen, and I'm in the ER. So I'm not a fan of mosquitoes either, but you know, when I'm out surveying and I know it's mosquito season, which is like half the year in the swamp that I live, I just take over-the-counter allergy as preventative, and I do what I can, but I'd rather do that than spray against insects.
Awesome. Well, we are just 3 minutes past 1 o'clock. So I don't see any more questions coming in. I'll open it up. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask another one, I'll give you a second to do that. But barring that, in the next couple of seconds here, I want to say thank you to our presenter, Dr. Browne, and in a great month of October. She gets a ton of speaking requests in the month of October with Halloween coming up about bats. So thank you all for coming. Terry mentioned she used to live in Austin, where the Congress Street Bridge has a colony of Mexican brown bats in the millions. What a sight to see when they emerge at dusk. Yeah,
it is amazing. It's if I had ever visited the state, I would have picked University of Texas over Texas A&M in a heartbeat. Just from that bridge alone, I would have said, this is my place. It's my happy place now.
Yeah. I've also had the chance at Carlsbad Caverns, which is another epic, just a wonderful place to see. Just will astound you, and they have amazing bat emergences there as well. I would recommend, if you're ever in New Mexico, to stop by there. Well, thank you all again. Thank you, Dr. Browne, and we look forward to seeing y'all next month for forest pests and issues that could impact our forests. So thank you all, and we'll see you next month, hopefully.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shannon. Take care.
Yeah, no problem.
Bye-bye.
Bye.